Anyway, this is week 3 of the Revolt of the Planters. Next week is week 4, and that ends it. That'll be more the military end of this, and how you get a sort of pseudo form of a military-industrial complex in the South, although they're kind of late getting it started. I guess you can go back to the idea of a country in 1861 whose major exports are cigar making and chewing tobacco is going to get into a war with a bunch of factory workers. I don't know, you don't know how that's going to work out in the end. But the fact of the matter is, I'm going to get more into today how what was considered an example, the Southerners like to call this an example of states' rights, really becomes in the end a sort of a strong central government exemplifying state socialism. That's virtually what you're seeing here. And kind of paving the way, if you will, for what's going to be coming down the pike, especially by 1918, 1919. So it's interesting what the experiment of Southernism really represents here. And just to let you know what's really coming down the road here, in January I'm going to be doing the American Gulag, bouncing off the South, that is. And that's going to be 4 weeks of slavery and how the system really comes about, because next year marks the 400th anniversary of Dutch traders bringing the first 20 blacks here as slaves. Yep, 400 years ago, 1619. That's a year before the Pilgrims get here. Jamestown, that's it, right. And then after that series is over with, it's the 130th anniversary of somebody's birthday, so I'm going to do 4 weeks on him, and that's Adolf Hitler. Yeah, that should be an upper. Depending on your political persuasion, could be. Or if you're a closet Marxist, maybe not. Maybe not. But I'm going to be doing that. I'll take a week off after the Gulag, but then in February, Adolf Hitler. And so, marking the 130th anniversary of the Fuhrer's birth. He is a timely individual, I guess, at this point. Yeah, sure is. And also part of that's going to be how he took power. I'm going to get into that. How he took... somebody just said you're seeing it. That's a discussion here. Anyway, to get back to the South, interesting here how this is considered an example. Again, the Southerners, you talk to some Southerners or you read some Southern historians here about states' rights, and the Southerners actually being the defenders of the American Constitution. It doesn't belie the underlying aspect here of slavery being a hallmark of the Southern economy. It really doesn't. I mean, without slavery, is there a Southern economy? I mean, it can also be called, he's shaking his head no, it could also be called a slaveocracy, using that terminology. The basis really of the Southern aristocracy, since they run the country virtually because of the strength of the plantations. And as I mentioned, these plantations, these plantation owners, where they reside here, really, they're fiefdoms. They really are. These plantations are fiefdoms, and the larger the plantation, the larger the fiefdom. They really control their area in which they live. And as the South expands, new states here, you're seeing what? An expansion of these fiefdoms. It's almost like nobility in the Middle Ages here, during the age of serfdom. However, this is trying to exist in an era of the snowballing of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, technology. Again, the age of reason, age of enlightenment, these ideas are festering here, and they're trying to form a landed. They're trying to salvage their landed gentry in this era. It's kind of late in the game. It's getting kind of late in the game for this, and so interestingly enough, and as I put down here, the Confederate Revolution was not a revolution from left, but from the right. substitute the British Crown for the United States government, substitute British banking interests for those of the North, substitute overweening British business interests for those of the Union. And it doesn't make any difference here. 1776, 1861, these people are trying to preserve their way of life. You're just substituting one enemy for another here. And interestingly enough here, when you go back to this idea of the Southern way of life, you know, some of them base it on what Jefferson and Madison did in 1798 in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts put in place by the Federalists when they were in power. Jefferson with the Kentucky legislature and Madison with Virginia getting something passed known as resolves, thinking that or stipulating that the Constitution here was a compact and that the states had the right to seek amends with, you know, deleterious federal legislation. In this case, the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was virtually against the law, considered a high misdemeanor, to criticize the government at this point in 1798. Of course, many Federalists considered Democrats, Republicans as too pro-French. And we're almost getting ready to go to war with the French. And so you couldn't really criticize, you weren't supposed to criticize the government, you weren't supposed to write anything against the government, you weren't supposed to speak really against the government. Christmas, it sounds like the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1917, 1918. It came back. Isn't there a movement afoot from the White House here to try to limit protests outside the White House or in the environs of the White House? I thought this country was founded on dissent. I mean, 1776 is a pretty good example of dissent. The Declaration of Independence? What is it that some people today have forgotten? Or some of those that are considered part of the brain trust have forgotten here. And so this idea of you know, supporting the so-called states' rights, again, comes to these resolves passed in Kentucky and Virginia come to mind again here with the tariffs. The tariffs of abomination in 1828, the Nullification Act in 1832, where the South were against these tariffs imposed by the federal government to protect what the Southerners thought were northern industrial interests, business interests, to protect them from imports coming in basically from Europe here. Don't you hear about tariffs again? Yeah, you do. And so the Southerners are concerned because what they're growing here, I mean, they're agrarian. They're growing cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, and they're doing what? That gets exported. So what are they afraid of? The Europeans putting tariffs on those goods. And what would happen to some of their exports? Would drop. That's what the Southerners are concerned with. And so when you get a state like South Carolina saying that, well, you know, there's one way of getting around these tariffs, and that's seceding. Well, if you elect officials to Washington, wouldn't the proper system here be that you go through those elected officials to try to change that legislation in Congress? That would seem to be the way to do things. But more and more Southerners are thinking that Congress is being dominated by Northern financial interests, Northern business interests. And so what's the alternative? We leave. We leave. And so interestingly enough, Andy Jackson, and he's from Tennessee, so he's a Southerner, right? Slaveholder, right? Yeah. He comes from what persuasion? Union, not disunion. You want to change something, you go through your elected officials to change same. That's what you do. Oh, and by the way, if you want to secede, you'll be hung from the highest oak tree. I can just picture what Andy Jackson would have done to the Bundys out in Oregon. Yeah, bye Bundy, she says. Yeah, that would have been interesting. That would have been interesting. Yes. Well, to a certain extent, that's true. Cottonism, let's say, let's call it Cottonism. You could make that case. So they're preserving that so-called privileged position as far as being agrarians, and that's the plan. But then again, who controls that? Really, the plantation owners. So having controlled that, they control the politics. To a certain extent, they do now. But that, to a certain extent, that's true. So you've got, again, getting back to what I mentioned last week, or the first week, about the Jeffersonian ideal versus the Hamiltonian ideal. In fact, you're going to see the power of the Hamiltonian ideal today in that handout, and I'm going to go through that. But you're on to something here, because back by 1861, when they begin to put the Confederacy together here, and I mentioned these firebrands of against the North, pro-Southerner. I mean, real firebrands like Robert Barnwell Rhett, Edmund Lowndes Yancey, people like this, who were ardent Southerners and vehemently anti-North. And yet, when the first Confederate Congress, if you will, comes together here in the spring of 1861, what happened to this idea of the firebrands? It died. Cold water was poured on it. And now you're having a so-called conservative style of government who's, the president, elected president, is Jefferson Davis. He's no firebrand. In fact, Jefferson Davis shed a tear or two when he left the United States Senate. And Alexander Stephens, the vice president, latched on to secession late. Judah Benjamin, who later becomes a Secretary of State for the South, hardly a firebrand. And Robert E. Lee wasn't a flaming firebrand. And so many of the leadership positions in the South, these guys aren't fire eaters. They're not really flaming Southerners from the perspective of really being radical. They're not. And so perhaps that underlying conservatism is beginning to take over, and this is going to help lead to a strong central government which is against states' rights. And why is that? Because you are now going to be in a large conventional war. And I'm going to get into more of the military end of that next week. But interestingly enough here, when you take a look at the economic deficiencies that plague the South, interesting that with the research I uncovered here, this is, again, the economic deficiencies from their Union competitor, meaning the Confederacy, highlights the notion of a nation of farmers going to war with a nation of factory workers. In this unfolding era of industrialized, commercialized, corporatized war, you are seeing that really develop now. In fact, go back to the French Revolutionary War. I mentioned that before, where you see France, in 1793, the defense minister Carnot issuing levée en masse. We're going to conscript the entire population and entire economy for war. And by the following year, France is going to have an army of over 731,000 men. And 3.5 million will have served. I mean, this is, and no longer can you rely on volunteers or professional soldiers. We are conscripting the population for war. Why? There's more weapons, there's more factories. Well, what do you think is going to happen here? I mean, we're 70 years down the road. And so interestingly enough, beginning in 1860, the South produced 76,000 tons of iron ore versus 2,500,000 tons in the North. Right off the bat, who's going to win this? Southern mills rolled 25,000 tons of iron, and the North rolled 400,000 tons. Interesting here, too, from the perspective here, the South, they raised cattle. Southern leather products amounted to $4 million in 1859, as opposed to $59 million in the rest of the country. The South produced wool. They had $1.3 million worth of woolen mills to process wool, compared to $35 million controlled by the North. In 1860, and here you are, 1860, the South, 20,631 factories manned by 110,720 workers, with a capital investment of $93,076,000, and they produced $155,531 worth of goods, as opposed to the North, which had 110,843 factories versus 20,631 for the South. And workers, instead of 110,000 workers, there are 1,147,986 factory workers in the North. Capital investment was $886 million, and production output, instead of $155 million and change, $1,655,544,000. Who's going to win this? Yes, that's correct. They were, not realizing here that you are going to be getting into an economic war. This is almost like comparing, if you will, you bring this up, the chances the Japanese had versus the United States after 41, and the Japanese went ahead with it anyway. Maybe that's the importance of Pearl Harbor here? The underlying essence of Pearl Harbor? Maybe that's Fort Sumter. Maybe that's Fort Sumter. But you are seeing, and as this goes on, and this becomes more and more apparent, the reality begins to sink in, what is the South going to do? They're going to have to industrialize. And therein lies another aspect of this revolution. Every revolution like war begins to take on a character of its own. It's not how it starts. It gets a characterization of its own. For instance, the Russian Revolution. Lenin, right? Having the so-called worker revolution. What happens when Stalin gets a hold of it? State capitalism, forceful industrialization of the Soviet Union. He's going to purge all the old Bolsheviks, and he's going to bring up a new strain of so-called proletarian revolutionaries like Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Kosygin, people like this. The whole flavor changes. The whole ambiance changes. That's what's going to happen here in the South. And so by going to war here and having to adopt industrialization and strong government control, well, what happened to the old South? It changes the South socially, economically, and culturally. You had a question. Well, one of the problems here is they thought, too, they might get help from the British and the French. That's not going to happen. And the British and the French. And one reason it's not going to happen here is, in the beginning, the South thought one of their aces in the hole was cotton. So they're going to withhold the cotton to force the British and the French. How's that going to work? Aren't the British, with their colony in India, growing cotton there? So how's that going to work? Despite the fact the South does dominate in the cotton industry, but they're not the sole supplier here. And in the end, when the South understands what they did, the Europeans see something very important here. The South does not have much bargaining power here. Look at their currency. They're going to try to finance 65% of the war with their currency. How strong is this currency? What's it backed by? Yeah, somebody says nothing. As opposed to the North, which will finance the war only 13 to 15% with currency. Guess where some of these Europeans are going to invest in? Not the South. They're going to invest north of the Mason-Dixon line, Isn't that where the resources are? Isn't that where, obviously here, that's where the factories are, getting back to your point over here. And so are the Southerners really up against it at this point? Yeah, they sure are. They sure are. And so when the war starts, sure, is the North militarily ready? No. But do they have the time? Yes, because they have everything on their side. Interestingly enough here, by the time you get to 1862, and Lincoln wants to end this conflict now. He wants to end this before this really goes on. Again, I find it interesting. I think it was Seward, when the South does secede, and Lincoln's hot to trot to keep the country together. He truly is here. He's truly hot to trot to keep this country together. And yet at the same time here, he has somebody like Seward who says, at last we're rid of those mosquito republics. That's the last thing Lincoln wants to hear. But it gives you an idea, perhaps, maybe Seward's not the only one who had contempt for the South. But the point I'm trying to make here is, Lincoln wants this over. So George B. McClellan is supposed to launch a huge offensive down that Virginia Peninsula, upwards of some 100,000 men. This is almost a forerunner of what the British are going to do at Gallipoli in 1915. A huge amphibious operation. And it's really a testimony to the North in 1862. We're not at the height yet, but in 1862, what they possibly can do here, moving all these cannon, ball, powder, men, horses, cavalry onto this peninsula. And the idea is to move across that peninsula, take Richmond, take the capital, and perhaps end this thing. Well, McClellan's a plotter. He moves slow. Molasses goes through a needle quicker than he moves here. And so but in February 27, and you could see even though militarily speaking, McClellan moves slow, what's happened here politically? February 27, 1862, Jefferson Davis suspends habeas corpus, which means martial law is not too long in coming. And on March 1st, just a couple of days later, really, March 1st, Jefferson Davis proclaims martial law, and James H. Winder, a Confederate general, will take control of Richmond militarily, the capital of the Confederacy. Winder, by the way, will later be the commanding general of Andersonville Prison. That was a hellhole. And so what does he do? Institutes martial law in a country that boasts that it's protecting states' rights, the rights of the individuals. And what does he do? You have to have a passport to give it in and out of the town. The transportation, like stagecoach, trains, and hotels, have to have a record and report to the government who comes in, who comes out, who goes out. The Ordnance Bureau, get this, the Ordnance Bureau, taking control of civilians' firearms. Now, I don't know about you. You go down below the Mason-Dixon line and you tell some Southern lad that you're going to take his gun. You'll get that gun, business end first. And so when you hear from some of your friends here who are really pro, and I mean, to be honest with you, yeah, I'm pro a citizen having a chance to own a firearm as long as they're competent enough. I agree with that. But at the same time here, to say, I know some of my friends will say, well, no, they'll never take our guns. Really? Go back to 1862 in Richmond. And this is the South. Why? You are seeing strong central government being built here right now. So the idea of states' rights and the Southerners as defenders of the Constitution, dying at this point. Yes. Well, yeah, but at this point, the North really isn't ready to prosecute the war yet. And so you're seeing in 1862 where they are able to take control of some cities on the coasts and also along that Mississippi route area on the western side of the Confederacy. But to really launch a mass offensive to end the war itself, apparently not only did they have not enough of an army, but it's the commanders. And next week I'm going to go into how West Point influences this war. It does. Yes. Well, in a way it does, because he understands that the capital of the Confederacy is going to be perhaps fall. And so the civilian government really can't defend the Confederate capital. The Army has to do it, so we'll just proclaim martial law and have the Army organize everything. And that's what's going to happen. Beg your pardon? Well, they'll evacuate, but then that government will come back. But it's going to be in the hands of General Winder. The problem here is McClellan was a plotter, and Robert E. Lee will launch a counterattack, and the North will evacuate the peninsula, and now you're in for a long war. But that long war, you know, people say, well, gee, it's too bad the casualty rate goes up, but what did it do politically, socially, culturally, economically to the South? That's the story here. And so here at this point, you are seeing now stronger, you know, a stronger hand by the central government, the Richmond government, in the economy. The Cotton Bureau. Get a load of this one, the Cotton Bureau. You know, one of the big assets for the South is cotton. Now you're going to have a Cotton Bureau. The government more and more, as the war goes on, will dictate the market price of cotton and take control of cotton. That's state capitalism. Do you think a lot of the plantation owners like that one? No. No, they don't. How about the small farmers? Again, the small farmers were supplying hay, grain, livestock to the plantations and getting paid for it. Now the central government, the Richmond government, wants that livestock, wants that hay, and wants that grain. Why? To feed this huge army. And that army, upwards of 875,000 men are going to serve in the Confederate Army. An army does not produce, an army consumes. So that's going to be coming out of the lifeblood of the Southern economy, an economy that in the long run can't afford this. Down to the point where, yes, the taxes are going to go up on the people to pay for this. And so when you have a weak currency and people can't pay their taxes, not all of them can, what do? You actually pinch the grain, pinch the hay, pinch the livestock for the army. In other words, the collection squads go down and grab what they need. So the South is doing the same thing Joe Stalin is going to do in 1926, 1927 to the Soviet peasant. The North financed the war. Well, they were getting a lot of investors investing in the Northern economy, because in the government, because they're going to win this. That's where the action is. Not down south. The action is up in the north. The South actually, and I'll get into this more next week, but in April of 1862, they announced conscription, a draft. They have to. Southern soldiers were enlisted for a year. And so what happens after the year is over with? No, we can't have that. And so the North will institute conscription in 1863. Of course, they have a larger manpower pool. That's part of the issue here. And so you are seeing more and more here this idea of the Southern government becoming a centrally controlled government. Interesting what else it inspires here. Now this is interesting here where this goes and how the South really begins to adopt industrialization. The disparity in economies necessitated the Confederacy too late to understand the new reality in the world. And that gets back to that question you asked earlier. The industrialization and resources are major building blocks to winning modern war. And that's what you're seeing here. Modern war in the modern world. That's what you're seeing here. During the siege of Vicksburg, and this gives you an idea where the South is going, for instance, production of some of what the Confederate Army needed was poured forth by a state, Mississippi, which was noted to be decidedly agrarian. This is what Mississippi did. This is 1863. Jackson, Columbus, Bankston, Natchez, Woodville, and Columbus produced 10,000 uniforms in a week. This is an agrarian state. Other facilities and enterprise in Jackson produced 200 hats a day for the Army. Factories sponsored by the Confederate government, and this is where else we're going, not private factories, government-owned factories. Again, state capitalism. Produced 8,000 pairs of shoes on a weekly basis. 60 wagons and ambulances were built every week in Canton and Enterprise. And in Magnolia, a tannery produced 6,000 hides per week. This is an agrarian state. How do you think the North is doing here? And so, interestingly enough, what does this spur with regards to Southern society? Urbanization. Where are the factories? In or near the cities, right? So what happened to this Southern provincialism as spurred on by the plantation system? Individualism in the South. It's dying. You have to have a cohesive society to wage a modern war. I'm sure a few of you here were kids in the when America got into the war 41 to 45. What did you see happen here? Men were in uniform, and what was happening in the factories? Women working in the factories here? Was it a collective effort? Weren't people giving up their salt, their meat, their sugar, so on and so forth, right? Rationing gasoline. Wow, that's a big one. All for what? The war effort. People were more or less on the same page. That's what they're attempting to foster here. It's early in the game, but that's what they're attempting to foster here. And so what else is it doing? Some people are moving out of the countryside into the cities. The rural South is dying here with this spate toward urbanization. And again, digging out some figures here are interesting. Selma, Alabama, 1860, 3,000 workers working in an arsenal. By 1863, the labor population in Selma, Alabama, 10,000 people. Mobile, Alabama, went from 29,000 people in 1860 to 41,000 by the end of the war. And that's just an example. Richmond's population went up. One source I consulted said it went up twice, 2.5 times, because of urbanization. Now, it's not just production. As more men are joining the Confederate Army, well, some of the wives aren't going to stick around. Where are they going? To the cities that their husband's unit is attached to. And then some of them wind up working in the factories. This is a wholesale change of the South, socially. Is this a revolution itself? Yes. Is it one that's really talked about or written about? Doesn't apparently be the case. That doesn't seem to be the case. And so what's happening here? You're paving the way for the future urbanization and industrialization of the South. You know, historical changes of note, many of them, most of them, do not happen overnight. It's a long, slow progression, to the extent that I'm sure some of you remember, and I used to see the remnants when I was a kid, the old textile and hat factories up here, like in Danbury, in Norwalk. Where'd they go? The South. The labor was cheaper there, right? Yeah. Now where is all this stuff gone? Yeah, they found a new place to make the stuff. Yes. No. But during that threat to the Capitol, they instituted John Winder will take control of Richmond and be that wielder of martial law. But it gives you an idea of what's the potential of such a thing in this country. Well, after the war, after federal troops are pulled out, 1878, you will see a degree of, I don't know if you want to use the term normalcy here. I mean, keep in mind, in 1865, this country will have a total of about 144,000 factories. You know, and after this war is where it really goes here. America industrializes, America as a whole industrializes. And so by 1900, 335,000 factories, we're the world's ranking industrial power. And that part of that is what comes out of this. You know, this war in the end is going to kill agrarianism. It's going to kill it as far as being a legitimate political power, although let's understand farmers do have some political pull here. But then again, if you look at America's agrarian potential today, how much of that is run by companies like Monsanto, Archer, Midland, Daniels, so on and so forth. These guys aren't dirt farmers. They're conglomerates, right? Yes. Well, some of these plantation owners will actually, some of them will put together their own regiments. Yeah, they do. Some of these guys will leave, some of these plantation owners will leave, many of them officers, to fight in this war. Even some of their plantation overseers. And so the wife and the kids are left running the plantation. And so does that make it easier for some of these slaves to bolt? It's, you know, somehow having back then, the wife running the plantation as opposed to the overseer with the lash. Does it make life a little easier? Maybe. But then again, at the same time here, some of the womanhood is changing. You know, womanhood was the Southern belle, so to speak. Again, this is all changing. Women now working in factories in the South. It's redoing Southern society here. And again, going back into this, that's part of this revolution that's happening in the South, a social revolution, also an economic revolution. Why? Because of modern war. Yes? You know, there were some, especially in the beginning here, some of these firebrand, like this Reverend Thornwall, I think his name was, who I believe was a Baptist, and very much the firebrand, secession, preserve the Southern way of life, almost like that Nathan Fisk up in Massachusetts in 1774, 1775, who's urging people up in well, it's going to be the Bay State, I guess, but urging people in that colony, grab a musket, come together, grab a musket, shoot the British. How would you like to give that guy money every Sunday? And so, you do have these real firebrands in 1774, 75, 1861, 1862, looking to defend this Southern way of life. And so you are seeing a wholesale change here of the South due to this so-called revolution. And interestingly enough, that even though the South is going to change socially, economically, what happens to the idea of preserving the Southern aristocracy? It fails. You can't buck the tides of history. You can't do it. You won't do it. And so many of these Southerners, getting back to your question earlier, They couldn't see apparently they couldn't see the forest through the trees here. You know, and again, and I'm going to get into this more next week, when you see generals like Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman, they seem to understand, at least from the edge here, modern economy and modern war, and how economics, you know, political economics has changed war, technology, the Industrial Revolution. And I don't think that's seen in the South. I really don't. But by the end of the war here, interestingly enough, take food prices, by the way. Where do you think food prices are going? Up with a weak currency. And so does that, you know, interestingly enough, when this war is over with, to show you where this goes, it wasn't unusual to find a Southern soldier, you know, from a land of farmers. The guy could have 30, 40, 50, 60 rounds of ammunition in his pocket, and he's starving. What happened to the Southern way of life? It's dying here. It's dying here. And so just like in Germany in 1916, when the Hohenzollern regime, you know, again, Paul von Hindenburg, Erich Ludendorff, you don't have that here to the extent you didn't have a military dictatorship in the South. But one of the institutions of the German government is taking control and instituting state control. It's a military dictatorship. But here in the South, you begin to see the same sort of thing, state control of a country that boasted of states' rights. And not everybody in the Southern government was actually on board with this. Even Alexander Stevens, the vice president, was really in the end against Davis, calling Davis a despot, Jefferson Davis a despot. A despot. Keep in mind here, too, the growing power of central authority. Davis signed 39 vetoes against his own government, against his own Congress. And guess what? Out of those, it shows you the power here that Davis is really accumulating here. Out of those 39 vetoes, only one was overturned by the Confederate Congress. Only one. And so I find that statistic alone is really astounding in a nation that says they are the defenders of the American Constitution and the defenders of states' rights. What happened here? Modern war changed the economy, and it helped make this country a country of state capitalism, state socialism. Fascinating here what you see when you begin to tear this apart. And next week, when I get more into the military aspects of this, the Southern Army as opposed to the Northern Army. Interesting here what you see, this idea of a massive state-sponsored army on both sides of the line, and how this actually helps to change America at this point. Because keep in mind, up to this war, America basically fought its wars for the most part with volunteers, the militias. Now what are you seeing? Large conventional armies, which your founders, especially George Washington, were dead set against. Interesting. Yes? I'm sure some of these guys realize this was a mistake from the start. Again, going back to what you stated earlier about, you know, understanding the reality here of resources, industrial production, and finance. You know, as the war goes on, you're going to see, in fact, you could see this on the ground level. The South had a lot of desertions in the Army by 1863, especially 1864-65. there were many desertions. And so you will see here, as the South, understanding these desertions, the Southern government is going to expand the draft law, conscription law, from 17 to 35 years old, 17 to 50. They have to have a wider manpower pool. And they're not allowing blacks in the Army. Now you've restricted yourself. And so it's becoming apparent more and more to people by 1864, 65 that this is a losing effort. And it's not just the people up at the top. I mean, people on the ground are beginning to understand this too. Almost like Germans did in 1944. Like some Japanese by 1944. This isn't working. But how do you stop it? Correct, because the people themselves, unless they want to have a counter-revolution, can't stop it. And that's an issue. That's a problem. That's a problem. Some of it was, sure it was. In fact, keep in mind, before the war, the plantations are making money with the American buck. After 1861, when they decide to secede, what's happening to American dollar here? It's drying up. And what are they replacing it with? Southern currency. These guys are going to be sucking wind after a while. But then again, when they don't have the money to pay back taxes and so on and so forth, what's happening to some of them? They're losing their land. Well, speculators go down there and they're having a field day. And that's not going to endear the North to Southerners either. During so-called Reconstruction. The carpetbaggers, yeah, okay, here we go. But the scallywags. But wasn't that going to happen anyway? I mean, you always have your opportunists here. But that's not going to, and especially when a president like Lincoln is looking to bring the country together, not divide it even further. Correct. Andrew Johnson's the president. Right. But again here, and I brought this up in particular on the bottom of that, one of the last page, or the page before the last page, about revolution. Interesting, the man who says this. Revolution is not the course of more or less unruly events. Rather, revolution is the complete break of a time and its people. It is the transformation in the thinking of peoples. And you know who wrote that? Ernst Röhm, who was chief of Hitler's SA, or the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers. He wrote that in his pamphlet, The National Socialist Revolution and the SA. Yeah, is right. Ernst Röhm. Many people don't remember him. He's a fascinating character in the early years of the Nazi movement. And if you're looking to understand Hitler from 1934, he's a man to get to know, because everyone remembers Goering and Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler. They don't remember Ernst Röhm. And Ernst Röhm was one of the only one, or practically the only one, able to call Hitler Adolf, or even Addy. But he was an ardent revolutionary from the perspective of trying to understand revolution. And revolution from where? The right. And so, interesting here, the break in time, the great break of time and its people. And so going back to your question here, with this Southern Revolution, do Southerners really understand the time they're in? Apparently not. And so, according to Röhm here, a transformation in the thinking of the people, there's a break in the time and the people have to take control of their time to perpetuate their revolution. That I find fascinating. That I find fascinating. But the South was up against it from the start. Did they really have a chance to win this? Not really. Especially when they did not have the economy to really take charge to invade the North. Okay, they do in 1862, Battle of Antietam, and then there's the Battle of Gettysburg. But can that army really go all the way up to Boston? No. They don't have that capability. They lack that capability because of what? A functioning capitalist economy. Yes. There is some truth to that, and that goes back to, again, you know, that type of mindset. The Japanese thought that. If we have our, you know, the home islands, but then we have that buffer of islands that we have control of. And when the Americans lose too many men trying to take those islands, they'll maybe consider a peace. How'd that work out? You know, in both cases, it doesn't work. You know, and another thing that the Southerners didn't seem to keep in mind here was that the British, you know, they're 3,000 during the American Revolution. They don't have a lot of men here, and because they're stretched because of the British Empire, it's global. At top end, they only had 45,000 men here. At the same time, 25% of the men here at its height are mercenaries, the Hessians. But they're 3,000 miles away. What the South apparently doesn't really give importance to is that their enemy now is right next door. And they're not 3,000 miles away. And unlike the British back in, you know, during the American Revolution, this enemy next door is loaded with factories. It's loaded with resources, has a large population. So again, going back to a negotiated peace, and apparently later on, and they have to understand this too, the general is Ulysses S. Grant, and he'll lose 3 of his men for every 1 of yours. And so he's going to win this in the end. And so again, going back to your what you're saying before, they really didn't figure this out. Remember in the movie Gone with the Wind, Rhett Butler? What is it that Clark Gable said? They said, we Southerners have what? Cotton and arrogance. Yeah, at one point, yeah, for the South? Yeah, they do. In the end, not really. But they thought it really would be, because they thought these tariffs that were imposed by the United States government on European goods coming here protected more northern industrial interests as opposed to the South. And the South lacked that industrial capability, but they thought what they're exporting, they're going to take it on the chin here. Not to the extent that they feared. But at the time, who's to say what's going to happen 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever the case may be. And so they're very concerned in 1828, 1832. But then again, Andy Jackson, you know, you want to change this, go through your elected officials. But you can't secede. And they won't. Yet. Yes. Well, you know, I mean, again here, when the South withholds cotton from the British and the French, you know, the British and the French really are at this point, who cares, really? You know, I mean, the British are, well, yeah, but I mean, at the same time here, I mean, the Brits have India. They can grow cotton there. In fact, the British at one point, they're already moving their Indian empire into the Middle East. In fact, they even had the idea in the 19th century of moving 2 million Indians into the Middle East to grow cotton. That idea doesn't happen. They were going to call these people pioneers. And so the French, they're already in. Even by 1857, they really start. But by the end of the American Civil War, they're getting heavily involved in Southeast Asia, where, you know, again, what you're implying here, you know where this is going to go. And so the South is really, you know, threatening the British and French economy? I don't think so. That you know, doesn't really happen here. Now, there's other avenues. There's other sources of tobacco, rice, sugar. Sugar. How about in Central and South America? How about the Caribbean islands? They need the South, and so is the South shooting themselves in the foot? Yeah, it could be. No, not could be, it is. They are. And so this idea of building a Southern nation, That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. All the North has to do, especially since they know they're getting investments from the British and the French, not the South. So all they have to do is just plan for the long haul. And that's in reality what they're doing. This is the same rationale that Joe Stalin's going to use against Hitler when Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Play for the long haul. That's what America did with Japan. Play for the long haul. We can afford to do it. They can't. And in every instance here, you take a look at the North and the South. Take a look at the Germans in the First World War. Take a look at the Germans and Russians in the Second. America and Japan in the Second. Who wins? The one who had the most resources, population, and industry, and money, basically. Of course, later on, you're talking about a decisive resource called oil. That really doesn't come into play here. But the basic premise is the same, and this is where you've gone. This is where modern societies are going. Those who win these wars these large conventional wars are the ones with the people, the resources, and the industry. It's a trend. It's a trend. Of course, maybe now you don't see that to the extent, especially with all the bodies being used now. Technology has changed that. But here at the same time, you're seeing that effervescence of technology in this war, the American Civil War, or the war between the states, which to all intents and purposes is a conventional war fought for revolutionary reasons per the South, to establish the Southern nation. And they're going to lose. They're going to lose. They didn't have the economy. But in the long run, what does it do? It really kills the Southern aristocracy, and now urbanization starts in the South. Industry begins to take off in the South. The South is changing. You're still going to have a lot of big farms. That's not going to stop. But more people are moving what? To the cities. And industrialization will start here. Interesting you're saying that because as Southerners begin to leave the Union, many of them are Democrats. And so many Democrats are leaving Congress. And so that will help Lincoln fill that void and help him get elected. And so the South, in trying to forge, at least politically at this stage, this so-called Confederacy, are shooting themselves in the foot to a certain extent because they'll ensure Lincoln's election. And Lincoln's the man that wants to preserve the Union, and Lincoln is going to be that war leader that's going to defeat the Confederacy. And so, this idea of secession, as this is gaining steam here, as a prelude to the elections, they're shooting themselves in the foot at this point politically. And again, going back to people like Jefferson Davis, so on and so forth, who leave Congress and go south. In fact, I'm going to give you some figures next week, which I've dug out this week about the military. The figures are astounding with regards to West Point officers who stay north, some who go south. It's the same sort of thing. Interesting here. It's fascinating to see how the nation divided itself. But yeah, that was a big bearing here. As the South is seceding, and most of these people were what? Southern Democrats. As they're leaving, what's happening to the Democratic Party? They're losing people. And so who's gaining here? The Republicans. Interesting. Interesting. Fascinating. And it's almost like, I know there's complaints today by some people as to what some Republicans in certain states are doing with voting rights. Yeah. Well, maybe you're seeing the same sort of thing happening here, but the Southerners themselves, as Democrats, are giving the election really, to a certain extent, to Lincoln by seceding. So, interesting development there. It's fascinating how this, well, you know, looking at this war from the perspective of being a revolution and the social economic revolutions that are underneath here ongoing over the long haul, what they represent. It's more than just the war. It's more than just the war. Interesting. And then what it does to the country over the long haul. Yes? There were many of these Southern flags. I mean, what some people consider the stars and bars, that the cross, that's actually the Confederate battle flag. That's not the stars and bars. The Confederate stars and bars, some of them actually had, you can actually Google these. It's probably the best way to take a look at some of these Confederate flags, look at them online. Some of them had the stars and you know, the cross stars on a smaller version on different designs. But that large flag with the cross and the stars, that's actually the Confederate battle flag. But the flag itself was supposed to denote the South as the defender of the Constitution. Of course, with the appropriate stars for each Confederate state. But you go online and you can type in, don't use Confederate, you can type in the Confederate stars and bars. You might see the battle flag, but that's not real. Some people equate that with being the stars and bars. It's not. That's the Confederate battle flag. But the government had several flags, a number of flags during the war. But it wasn't necessarily that flag flying, you know, through government buildings, which is considered the Confederate battle flag. That red flag with the blue stripes with each star. That was what the Army carried into battle, representing each of the states. That's like the Japanese flag. If you take a look at the Japanese flag, there was a different flag. You had the white flag with the red ball, the land of the rising sun. Then you had the military flag, which had that flag with the ball, but all those lines coming out of the flag. Beg your pardon? The rays of the sun, right. And so that's the military flag. And so the stars on that X are really, that's the battle flag. The other flag, the stars and bars, is really the government flag. But it came in different guises. And in most cases, the cross with the stars was small on the government flags. On the battle flag, that is the battle flag. Interesting when you had that neo-fascist coup in Kiev in February, March 2014, when Yanukovych beat feet and went to Russia, the elected president. There's a video of the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev, and you've got the Ukrainian flag flying, and on one of the rafters is the Confederate battle flag. Some of these right-wing extremists in Ukraine consider it a flag of liberty or revolution. And then, interestingly enough, being hung next to the Confederate battle flag was the Nazi Wolfengel's flag of 1942-43, which the Nazis were flying in Ukraine in World War II. That's like that, what was it, Edmund Ruffin, that Southern Firebrand, I think it was Ruffin, who was an older gent, and he pulled the first lanyard. He wasn't even in the Army. He pulled the first lanyard on the attack on Fort Sumter, and he pulled lanyards in different battles. And then after the battle, he'd like to walk out in the battlefield and see if the round he fired killed anybody. And then when the war was over with, being such an ardent Southerner, he wrapped himself in the Confederate battle, going back to the fact, the battle flag, and shot himself. He was out there, and for want of a better description. But you had these people rally around the flag. You have people like that. Every country produces them, and so yeah. I mean, the idea he struggled for is gone. So what sense is there to live after the defeat? Apparently to him, he didn't think there was, so he killed himself. So, tragic, but that's the way it is. Every society produces them. So, yes? The Russian? Whoa. Number one, with the Russian Civil War, anywhere from upwards of 8 to 10 times as many deaths. Yeah, that was a free-for-all, that one was. Of course, keep in mind, during the Russian Civil War, you had the Allies were in Russia at one point, and you also had, in 1920, the newly minted Poland invaded Russia. You know, the Poles wanted more territory than what they were going to get at Versailles, and they thought they could take it out of the Russian carcass. And Trotsky's going to organize that Red Army and throw the Poles back. Yeah, that's part of this. And anywhere it's estimated, you'll never get an exact number, but anywhere from 3 to 5 million people died in the Russian Civil War. Not many people died in the Russian Revolution. That's the thing. It's the Civil War where a lot of them got killed. And most were peasants, because most of the Red Army and the White Armies were made up of peasants. And so, but again, that was real. And then you had in France too, especially during the Terror, thousands died. And so, you know, this is countries descend into this violence. They're eating themselves here is what they're doing. And you could say the same thing between the North and the South at this point. Not to the extent that it happened in Russia or even in France. Thank God for that. Thank God for that. Yes? Well, the Allies, you know, the Soviets used to make great hay of this. You guys invaded us to kill the proletarian revolution. All that, they know that stuff. But in essence, they didn't send enough men to really do that. A lot of this was to protect the supplies and stores that they sent to Tsarist Russia, and they didn't want it falling into the hands of the Soviet government, the Bolshevik government at this point. And so they really don't send enough men here to really invade this country to help the whites. The Japanese, on the other hand, had 90,000 men in Siberia. Wilson sent maybe 8,000, 9,000 men to Siberia. And that was a gentle reminder, don't take liberties, we're watching. But eventually all these men are going to be taken out. You know, I mean, keep in mind the time here, 1918, 1919, with the war winding down and then the war being over, many of these families don't want their men in Russia, they want them home. Especially with regards to the British and the French, they've been in the trenches for 4 years. When is enough enough? We want them home. And Americans are in the same boat here. We want our boys home. What are they in Russia for? That's the Russians' problem. Let them handle it. And Lenin will. Lenin will. One way or the other, he will. But no, it was a free-for-all. And that goes into, you know, 3 to 5 million dead by 1921. And again, you see a commonality here with the South. War socialism, and I'll get into more of that next week, but you see this here in Russia, war communism. You know, making the economy work for war. We're going to organize the peasant and what few factories we have for the war. It will be for the war effort. And that's what the South tries to do. Too little, too late. They can't compete with the North. But again, the Russian Revolution, they didn't have a northern enemy like the South does. That's an internal civil war which the Reds will win. And one of the major reasons they'll win it, because the more peasants will support them than support the whites. So there are commonalities and then differences too. So, but that's a good point though, bringing up the Russian Revolution. So some of these guys came from the mountains. They go back to the mountains and their farms. Try finding them. I mean, you know what's interesting here? Even getting down, this brings to mind, you just triggered a thought here, something I didn't say earlier. But it has something to do with some of these guys from the mountains here. The Confederate government made it illegal, you know, for making that bootleg hooch, the moonshine. Some of that was from grain, right? Well, guess what? You can't make your moonshine from grain anymore because we need the grain to feed the horses and the soldiers. And they issued laws against that. And so so here's a way of somebody making money who no longer can, at least legally now. It's against the law because the Confederate government needs that grain to feed the army and the horses. And so some of these guys escaping back into the hills, what do you think they're doing? You know, again, it sounds funny, but then again, it's not. Yeah. But they had a tough time, the South, after a while. And you know, and again, and you can see where people of a privileged position take advantage. I was just reading a thing about this where, you know, when Lee's army surrendered, some of these guys are in rags. And yet the governor of North Carolina had 90,000 new uniforms in storage. But again, that's an excellent point. You know, where did some of these guys go? A lot of them came from farms from the backwaters and the mountains, and they're going back there. And the South really does not have that capability to send a lot of men to go get them. They need the men at the front. And so if you could hide out for the duration, how are they going to catch you? You know, so yeah, it's really shocking if you're in the South in 1864-65 what happens here to the Southerners. I mean, I'm not asking you to feel sorry for them, but then again, you know, it's the reality. Modern war. You always had deserters in every war. You always have that. But here, in a modern, so-called, you know, economic war is really what this is. And the South just can't wage it. They can't do it. Yes? Whoa. Yeah. You know, I was watching a special here on welfare, and they were looking at blacks in New York City and poor whites in places like Mississippi and Louisiana. And interesting the differences here. There were some of these people that they interviewed, like in Mississippi. You know, and you take a look at these people, and some of them, they're what teeth they have aren't in too good a shape, and they live in such conditions of poverty, and yet they've been doing this for like 5 generations. And they said, you know, we don't believe in government handouts, and God will provide. And, you know, you have to answer, God will provide. You've been living like this for 5 generations. You know, God's not going to open up the Red Sea here for you. That's not going to happen. And so some of these people won't take that handout, and yet they'll constantly vote for politicians that will make sure they don't get the handout. You know, in fact, I was watching another special on some of these people in the poor areas of Texas, and you know many of them voted Republican. But the fact of the matter is, this is like going on 3 years ago, and they were telling their representatives who they were going to vote for. You make sure you tell Mr. Obama not to take away my Social Security, but not make it a federal program. You know, going back to the Southerners seceding, I found a quote, and I put it on the handout for next week, by Grant about that. And so that quote is going to be on that handout. Interesting what Grant says about the Southerners and the Constitution. That's interesting.